Welcome to the debate. Right now, 7 out of every 8 people listening to this are, well, actively withholding their best ideas from their employer.
Yeah, it's pretty wild when you think about it.
It really is. According to recent Gallup data, an enormous majority of the global workforce feels just completely disconnected from their workplace.
Right, and if you're listening and wondering why your team's brainstorms are always dead silent, or, why that big innovation initiative flatlined, well, it's because when people disengage, the very first thing they take off the table is their discretionary effort.
Exactly. They stop experimenting entirely.
Right, they stop taking risks, which is terrifying for any organization today. I mean, we're operating in an era of relentless technological disruption. If your employees aren't continuously innovating, your organization isn't just stagnating, it's actively dying.
Absolutely. People are holding on to their best ideas just to survive the corporate grind, right? When their companies need those ideas the most. And, well, that brings us to the core of what we are dissecting today. We're looking at Dr. Jonathan H. Westover's research on participative leadership and employee creativity.
Yes, a really fascinating piece of work.
It is. The literature agrees that we need employees to step up and innovate. But the divide, the real friction we are exploring today, is about exactly how you unlock that.
Right, the mechanism.
Exactly. I am arguing that employee creativity is fundamentally driven by the rigid structural mechanisms of participative leadership. I'm talking about hard architecture, explicit decision rights, transparent data systems, and formally distributed authority.
So, bureaucracy.
Well, to put it bluntly, yes. I believe that the right bureaucracy, the right structural framework actually forces genuine empowerment and ultimately protects creativity.
And, well, my position is that looking at an organizational chart to solve a human behavioral problem is just missing the forest for the trees. I argue that structural frameworks are completely hollow and, honestly, sometimes even destructive, without the deep interpersonal cultivation of psychological safety.
Destructive? That's a strong word.
I mean it, though. Without a culture that genuinely removes the social and career fear of taking a risk, all those structural participation tools you mentioned just become a cynical box-checking exercise. The culture, not the structure, is the true catalyst for creativity.
Well, let's start with the idea of structure as a protector of creativity. Because I know the word bureaucracy usually sends people running for the hills. We usually think of structure as the enemy of innovation.
Because it usually is.
Fair, but Westover's source material defines true participatory leadership not as some vague open-door policy where a boss says, hey, my door is always open. It requires explicit information sharing and the actual formal transfer of power.
Right.
There's a 2022 meta-analysis by Wang and colleagues cited in the research that proves this. They looked across countless organizations and found a massive positive correlation between participatory leadership and creativity.
Yeah, they cited a row of 0.42, I believe.
Yes, exactly, a row of 0.42. And for those listening who, might not spend their weekends reading statistical behavioral science, a correlation of 0.42 is huge in this field.
It really is.
It essentially means that nearly half of the variance in whether a team is creative or not can be linked straight back to this leadership style. But here is the critical mechanism. The effect sizes in that data only strengthen when substantial authority is formally transferred.
Meaning the employee isn't just asked for their opinion. They are actually handed the keys to the car.
Precisely. Let me use an analogy. Think about an improv comedy stage.
Okay.
When you watch great improv, it looks like pure chaotic freedom. But anyone who does improv will tell you it only works because of one rigid structural rule. Yes, and.
Right, you have to accept the premise.
Exactly. You have to accept your partner's reality and build on it. That structural rule removes the ambiguity. It forces the actors to collaborate. If they didn't have that hard rule, they'd spend the whole time arguing over the premise of the scene.
Sure. Structural participation in a business does the exact same thing. It removes the anxiety of having to read your boss's mind because the rules of who decides what are explicitly written down.
Well, I actually love that you brought up the improv analogy because to me, it proves the exact opposite point.
Wait, really? How?
Yes. The rule of yes and is the structural framework, but imagine walking onto that stage terrified that your scene partner secretly thinks you are completely unfunny.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right? Imagine you know deep down that if you make a weird choice, they are going to leave you hanging out to dry in front of the audience. Are you going to take a bold, creative risk?
Probably not.
No. You are going to freeze. You'll stick to the safest, most boring choices possible. The structure of yes and cannot save you if the interpersonal trust, the psychological safety isn't there. I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Doesn't knowing the rule is strictly enforced give you the confidence to step out there in the first place?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That only works if you believe the enforcement is real. And this is what psychological safety actually is. It's not about being nice. It's a shared belief that interpersonal risk-taking is welcomed and will not be punished.
But structure...
Let me finish this thought. The text explicitly points out that without this foundational safety, employees engage in self-censorship. They do the math in their heads. They realize that challenging an assumption or proposing a wild idea might make them look incompetent or insubordinate.
So they just stay quiet?
Exactly. They minimize their visibility just to protect their careers. You can build the most advanced delegation matrices in the world, but if people are afraid, those structures sit entirely idle.
Okay, well, let's ground this in a real mechanism then. Let's look at how transparency, which is a pure structural tool, actually eliminates that fear you're talking about. Take a company like Buffer.
The social media company?
Right. They are famous for instituting extreme structural transparency. Anyone in the company can see the financial data, the strategic roadmaps, and even a spreadsheet of every individual employee's exact salary.
Which is a lot of data.
It is. Now, why does that drive creativity? Because when you implement a structure that forces employees to understand the actual organizational economics, they don't have to guess if their ideas are viable.
I mean, sure, but...
Can see the P&L, and I know our marketing budget is tight this quarter. I'm not going to pitch a $2 million Super Bowl ad, get rejected, and feel stupid. I'm going to creatively pitch a $10,000 guerrilla marketing campaign because the data guided me to the safe zone. The structure dictates the behavior, and it removes the interpersonal guesswork.
Wait, but think about what that actually looks like in practice. Data access means absolutely nothing if people are inherently afraid to speak up about what that data reveals.
How so?
Well, if I see that P&L at Buffer, and I notice that the CEO is spending way too much on an ineffective vanity project, am I actually going to call them out on it?
If the structure empowers you to, yes.
But the structure doesn't empower you. The culture does. Look at Bridgewater Associates.
Oh, right, the hedge fund.
Yeah. They are famous for their believability-weighted decision-making. It is an intensely structural approach. Every meeting is recorded, every piece of data is public, and employees constantly rate each other on iPads during meetings.
It's very intense.
It's extremely intense, but the only reason that intense transparency doesn't result in a dystopian nightmare of paranoia is because they have spent years cultivating a ferocious level of psychological safety.
Well,
They have an explicit cultural norm that allows and frankly demands that a junior analyst publicly challenge a billionaire founder like Ray Dalio. The culture of vulnerability is the engine. If you drop Bridgewater's structural transparency into a normal, fear-based corporate culture, it doesn't liberate the employees.
You think it backfires?
It weaponizes the data. It becomes a surveillance state where everyone uses the transparent data to cover their own tracks.
Okay, I see the risk of weaponization, but I think you are vastly underestimating how much structure insulates the human ego.
What do you mean?
Well, the reason an employee in a participatory system feels comfortable speaking up is precisely because the system protects them through something called procedural justice.
Let's unpack procedural justice for the listeners because it sounds a bit, academic.
Sure. It is actually a very simple, relatable concept. Procedural justice just means that the process used to make a decision is fair, transparent, and consistently applied to everyone.
Okay.
If you've ever pitched an idea at work and your boss just said no and moved on, you probably felt dismissed. You probably took it personally. But look at Patagonia.
The outdoor clothing brand?
Exactly. They use environmental committees where employees across all levels, evaluate sustainability proposals. Leadership still ultimately decides what gets funded. And realistically, most employee ideas are rejected because of budget constraints.
Right, you can't fund everything.
Exactly. Yet, those employees remain highly engaged and keep pitching you ideas.
Because they care about the environment?
No, I mean, yes, they do, but it's because the structural process is fair. When an idea is rejected at Patagonia, it comes with a clear, transparent rationale based on explicit criteria.
I see.
Procedural justice insulates the employee from arbitrary, personalized rejections. The structure creates the safety because the rules of the game are explicit. It takes the ego out of it. And when employees know the criteria are objective, you see the remarkable empirical outcomes the text mentions.
You're talking about the engagement stats.
Yes, organizations with these structures see 23 to 31% higher engagement scores and a massive 34% reduction in turnover. Structure builds the trust.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered how quickly the most perfectly designed procedural justice system falls apart if a leader reacts poorly in the moment?
What do you mean by poorly? If the criteria are objective, the reaction shouldn't really matter.
But we are primates. We are highly attuned for social cues. You can have all the transparent criteria in the world, but if an employee pitches an idea in that committee and the leader gives a subtle, disappointed sigh—
Oh, come on. A sigh?
Yes, a sigh or crossing their arms.
Or if that employee suddenly finds they aren't invited to the next big strategy dinner, the psychological safety evaporates instantly. The formal procedure does not protect you from the interpersonal chill of a boss who didn't like your idea. So how do you fix that without structure?
By explicitly engineering the cultural norms. This is why Pixar's brain trust model is so vital to study. Yes, the structure of the peer feedback session exists. Directors sit in a room and review early cuts of a movie.
Right, that's structural.
But the creativity doesn't come from the room itself. It stems entirely from the cultivated cultural norm that feedback must target the project, not the director. They literally train people to frame critiques as the second act is dragging rather than you failed to pace the second act. That norm keeps participants safe from ego destruction, and it requires leaders to model extreme vulnerability to sit there and take harsh criticism of their own work without getting defensive. Without that modeled behavior, a brain trust procedure is just a terrifying gauntlet.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because relying on leaders to continually model vulnerability is a remarkably fragile strategy.
Fragile?
Yes. What happens when that enlightened Pixar director leaves and a slightly more defensive leader takes over? If your innovation depends on the emotional maturity of your managers, you are always one bad hire away from losing your creative edge.
Well,
long-term creative capacity has to rely on embedding participation into the actual operating systems so that it outlasts any individual personality.
okay, give me an example of a system that outlasts a leader's ego.
Look at Morningstar, the massive tomato processing company. They eliminate formal hierarchy entirely. There are no bosses. Instead, they use a structural tool called colleague letters of understanding.
Right, where they basically write contracts with each other?
Exactly. Two peers sit down and explicitly negotiate their decision rights and responsibilities to one another, and they signed it. It operates like a web of commitments rather than a top-down org chart.
Fascinating.
These are hard structural commitments that guarantee innovation regardless of who happens to be the most influential person in the room that day. In fact, there is research cited in the material from organizations in Lebanon that highlights this exact tension between intention and structure.
Oh, you mean the study about open communication?
Yes. In that study, leaders scored very high on open communication, a 3.92 out of 5. They were talking to their teams. They were friendly. They felt they were being safe.
Right.
But when measured on actual empowerment, the score plummeted to 3.79. To me, that proves that leaders are culturally willing to be nice and have open conversations. But without hard structures, like a colleague letter of understanding, forcing actual delegation, they fundamentally fail to relinquish control. They need the structure to force their hand.
I come at it from a different way. See, I read that Lebanese research completely differently. To me, that gap between communication and empowerment
proves my point about the underlying psychology.
How so?
Leaders might score high on talking, but if they aren't empowering people, it means the psychological contract hasn't evolved.
The psychological contract?
Yes, it's the unwritten set of expectations between an employee and an employer. Historically, that contract was, I, the boss, have the answers, and you, the employee, execute my orders.
Sure.
Shifting from a directive environment to a participative one requires a profound identity shift for a leader. They have to stop being the heroic problem solver and become a facilitator of collective intelligence. You cannot structurally mandate an identity shift.
But Morningstar literally does mandate it through those letters.
But if two employees sitting down to write that Morningstar letter don't inherently trust each other, what happens? They weaponize the letter.
Weaponize it again?
Yes, they write it defensively to protect their own turf, or they use it to assign blame when a project fails. Consider Shopify and their concept of trust batteries. Shopify explicitly acknowledges that every single interpersonal interaction you have with a colleague either charges or depletes the trust between you. If the trust battery is dead, no structural tool will save you.
So how do you charge the battery without a process?
You do use tools, but their purpose is cultural. Look at Atlassian. They developed health monitor facilitation workshops. These are sessions where teams explicitly diagnose their own dysfunction. Yes, it's a tool, but its entire purpose is to repair the interpersonal fabric.
I see.
If leaders don't fundamentally reframe the psychological contract to offer genuine voice and safety in exchange for responsible autonomy, all those delegation matrices and letters of understanding just become exhausting bureaucratic paperwork.
Okay, I hear you on the risk of bureaucracy becoming paperwork. But those trust batteries and health monitors only function at scale because they are institutionalized processes. The company mandated them. And let's look at the individual well-being metrics tied to formal structures.
You mean burnout?
Exactly. The source material notes that employees report 18 to 24% lower burnout rates in participative environments.
Which I would argue is because they feel psychologically supported.
I disagree. I think that reduction in burnout doesn't just come from feeling culturally supported. It comes from the pure cognitive relief of clarity. It comes from the autonomy and the control that formal participative environments provide.
Clarity helps, sure.
It does more than help. When you clarify decision rights using something like a Rossi framework,
Which stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed.
right, when you explicitly write down exactly who is doing the work, who is ultimately accountable, who just needs to be asked for an opinion, and who just gets an email update, you eliminate the paralytic consensus seeking that drives modern employees crazy.
That is true. Consensus can be exhausting.
Think about how much burnout comes from sitting in a meeting where 10 people are arguing and no one knows who actually has the authority to make the final call. You remove the stress of ambiguity. In this sense, psychological safety is essentially a byproduct of structural clarity. When I know my boundaries, I feel safe to play within them.
I understand the appeal of that. I really do. It feels clean. But I would argue that true clarity is actually a byproduct of safety. Ambiguity is only stressful when you are afraid of getting punished for making the wrong assumption.
Wait, that's a really interesting distinction.
Think about it. In a modern, fast-paced company, things change too fast for a racy chart to always be perfectly up to date. There's always going to be gray area.
Always.
Right, so if you have a highly cultivated climate of psychological safety, where intelligent failures are openly celebrated, where leaders explicitly say, we know this is ambiguous, try something, and if it fails, we'll learn from it, employees can navigate that structural ambiguity just fine. They will step up, they will experiment, and they will innovate.
Even without the explicit chart.
Exactly. But if they are terrified of the consequences of making a mistake, no perfectly designed Rossi chart is going to convince them to stick their neck out. As I said earlier, they will just use the Rossi chart as a shield to deflect blame when things go wrong. Oh, I was only consulted on this, so the failure isn't my fault.
Well, it seems we are continually circling the dual pathways identified in Westover's synthesis of the research. Both elements are undeniably present, but it comes down to sequence and dependency.
Right.
I maintain that structural participative mechanisms, the distributed decision rights, the explicit frameworks, the transparent resource allocations, are the indispensable architecture. They are what operationalize creativity at scale across thousands of employees.
Sure.
Without them, you might have a very friendly, highly communicative, supportive organization. But it's an organization that can actually execute on its ideas because no one has the formal authority to pull the trigger.
And, well, I maintain that psychological safety, the consistent modeling of vulnerability by leaders, the explicit celebration of intelligent failure, the deep daily cultivation of interpersonal trust is the vital catalyst. It is what actually liberates the human beings inside your company to utilize those structures.
Liberates them, right.
Because as the research clearly demonstrates, structural participation without psychological safety doesn't just fail to produce creativity, it breeds deep, toxic cynicism. Employees see the company rolling out new empowerment frameworks, but they know the underlying culture is still punitive, so they just roll their eyes and keep their heads down.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of the text. Psychological safety without structural authority leads to intense frustration because people feel safe to share their bold ideas but lack the structural levers to make them a reality.
Absolutely.
The source material ultimately suggests that participative practices boost creativity directly through that structural empowerment, but they also operate indirectly by building those safe climates over time. You need the hard wiring of the structure, but you absolutely need the interpersonal current running through it.
It really is a fascinating duality. And I think there is so much more to explore in the source material regarding how organizations can continuously measure and improve both sides of this equation.
Like what Microsoft did.
Exactly. For instance, the way Microsoft, under Satya Nadella, completely revitalized their stagnant culture. They didn't just write new values on a wall. They used rigorous A/B testing and data discipline, pure structural mechanisms, to actually measure psychological safety and the adoption of a growth mindset across their teams.
That's a great point.
They treated the fuzzy, interpersonal culture change with the exact same empirical, structural rigor they used for product development.
Which beautifully bridges the two worlds. It proves that the blueprint and the messy reality of the construction site have to inform each other.
They absolutely do.
It leaves us with an incredibly compelling question for anyone listening today who is analyzing their own organization. When your team's creative engine stalls, where do you look first?
Do you need to overhaul the rigid structural blueprint and finally give people the real authority to act?
Or do you need to look at the interpersonal friction on the floor and ask yourself if your people are simply too afraid to use the tools you've given them? We will leave it to you to form your own conclusion on what your team needs right now. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.